Hello and welcome back. This is the week 4 lecture. So today we continue to work with narratives, but we shift our focus a little bit and we start talking about description. So really the way I structure things in our first unit, description is just a part of narrative. But we will be spending all of this week on description and how to sort of develop descriptive details, because that's a very important part of both reading and writing narratives. We need to be prepared to identify important descriptions in the narratives that we read, and then ultimately we need to be able to use description and include descriptive details in the narratives that we will eventually be writing. So that's our focus here in week 4, and once we cover description, we will be ready to start working on essay 1, which is the descriptive narrative essay. So we'll be doing that next week. We're going to spend all of next week talking about how we can actually put the essay together. So we're going to be working with some simple sort of syntax stuff or stuff relating to sentence structure, while also talking about sort of reviewing a lot of the key elements that we've already discussed in relation to narrative and making sure that we're also being descriptive. So we turn into authors next week when we start working on essay 1, but we remain readers primarily this week as we take a look at some examples of really good descriptive narratives. So what we are reading this week will not be as lengthy as what we looked at last week or the week before, because we're mostly focusing on description. So I'm giving you two very brief examples of good description. I do think both can still be considered narratives. They're just brief narratives that do not take very long to read, but they'll give us a couple of great examples of how to develop good descriptions. So let's just talk a little bit about description in general. I'll offer some definitions here today, and then I'll get you ready for the week 4 discussion post so we can practice some of this stuff by the end of the week. So just like narrative overall, description is a very common type of writing. Most of us are already pretty familiar with it. So, that's part of the reason why I like to get to it here in Unit 1. It's pretty familiar, and most of us have some experience working with it in the past. So, of course, like narrative, description shows up both in writing and in everyday speech. So often when we are talking to one another, we will use our powers of description. We will describe people. We might describe the places that we recently visited. We will describe events. We will describe inanimate objects. We might describe animals. We might describe the weather. As you can imagine, almost any narrative, any attempt to tell a story will usually include a lot of description. Because if we want the story to be successful, if we want the person that we are talking to or our readers to be interested in what we are narrating and describing, we need them to be able to see what we are talking about, hear what's going on in our story, perhaps even to smell things. They need to imagine things. They need to feel like they are there in the setting that we are describing. So any cursory, quick glance at a narrative, whether it's a book or an article, something on a website, something, just our weekend when we're narrating what we did this weekend, any brief look at a narrative will tell us how important description really is. So we can start with the 5 senses. I've already mentioned those briefly, and this gets us into imagery, which is one of the central concepts that I want us to cover here in week 4. So imagery, as I explain in our weekly overview, is one of the several terms I define. Imagery is really any type of language that forces readers or listeners to use one or several of their 5 senses. So you should think about those senses a little bit. Our sense of sight, our sense of hearing, our sense of smell, our sense of taste, and finally, our ability or our sense of touch, tactile. Those are the 5 senses that we normally think about and refer to, and imagery is simply any language that appears in a narrative that makes us use those senses. And this is often what we want good description to do. So, imagery can consist of individual words. It could consist of phrases. It could also consist of an entire sentence. But all of that language is designed to make us see things or hear things or smell things. The sense that we usually think about first and most often is our sense of sight. And that is probably the one that we use the most. That's probably the sense that gets engaged the most by descriptive language and imagery in writing. But don't neglect the other senses. Sometimes imagery will evoke our sense of smell or our sense of hearing. And again, just think about stories that you've read. Often sounds will be described. Smells might be described. Also, the way things feel might be described. Our sense of touch might come into play as well. So all 5 senses are operative. All 5 senses can be important, but we probably use our sense of sight the most, and it's probably the one that gets used the most in imagery. But think about all 5. So a few other basic definitions that I want to go over quickly before we can get into some more concrete, specific examples of good descriptive language. Let's think a little bit more about how descriptions work in narratives. So we can sometimes think about 2 different kinds of descriptions. What we can call objective versus subjective. The differences between these aren't always immediately apparent, but normally these 2 kinds of description will have 2 different purposes or 2 different goals at work. So with an objective description, usually the writer is striving for precision and accuracy. They are simply trying to accurately describe what something looks like, smells like, feels like, whatever. So the emphasis is on accuracy and precision when we're talking about an objective description. So usually we're going to leave emotion out of it. We're going to leave the personal feelings of the author out of it. So objective descriptions will often appear in what we might consider non-literary writing, or certainly non-fiction. So if you're reading a scientific journal, if you're reading an encyclopedia, these types of informational texts will often contain a lot of objective description because they don't necessarily want you to feel a particular way about what's being described. They're just striving for maximum accuracy, precision, and correctness. So we can think of a lot of examples when that kind of description will come in handy. But oftentimes when we are reading fiction, when we're reading somebody's memoir, perhaps, when we're reading more personalized writing, we're often going to encounter what we can call subjective descriptions. So these very much do draw on the emotions or the feelings and thoughts of the author. And they might be trying to make you, the reader, feel or think a certain way about what's being described. So with subjective descriptions, the writer is sort of investing some feelings into whatever is being described. So in this way, the description might capture something about the author or the narrator's state of mind, or what they're going through, what they're experiencing, and what they want us to do or think, or how they want us to respond. So in these cases, something might be described in a way that makes us disgusted or revulsed or, sort of afraid of it. Or perhaps something is described in a very inviting, tantalizing way, in a way that makes us want it, or in a way that makes us sort of think of it as a good thing or a desirable thing. So in a lot of narratives, in a lot of fiction, you're going to find subjective description. In sort of academic writing, non-narrative writing, more informational writing, you might see more objective description. But don't feel like they are mutually exclusive. Plenty of fiction will feature both. Sometimes in a novel or a short story, some things will be described in a subjective way, and maybe other things are described more in an objective way. And if we have an omniscient third-person narrator who perhaps isn't really sharing a lot of their personal thoughts and feelings, they're just telling us what the characters are doing, we might get a fair amount of objective description. Now, we might react certain ways to that, right? We might have our own feelings about what's being described, but we might not necessarily get the author or the narrator's feelings, right? Whereas with first-person narration, we're more likely to get more subjective descriptions because our narrator is probably our main character. They are sharing their personal thoughts and feelings usually, so their descriptions might then become more subjective. But it's very common to see both in the same text. But just be aware of some of these differences. Another term to be familiar with is dominant impression. So remember, with narratives, we talked about the overall narrative point or theme. And we said that most stories have a theme. They have a larger message, a larger meaning that they are trying to get across. Sometimes we might think of it as the moral of the story. We don't always have to use that terminology, but there's some kind of message, there's some kind of idea that the author or the narrator is trying to get across. So in that same way, we can think about descriptions as kind of having a central idea or an overall theme that they're trying to get across. And this is often referred to as the dominant impression. So this is kind of the point that a description is trying to make. Right? So this might mean the way a particular description makes the reader feel. It might be a particular idea that we are going to form about whatever subject or object is being described. So it might be a way that we feel. If it's a subjective description, the thing being described might be, clearly good, clearly bad. It might be mysterious. It might create happiness. But whatever we're supposed to think about it, however we're supposed to feel about it, whatever role the thing being described is supposed to play, all of that should really come through in the dominant impression. Any good description will deliver some kind of dominant impression. It might be positive, might be negative, might be somewhere in between, but usually we can walk away with it as a reader if we are really thinking about the description that we are reading. If we're paying attention, if we're looking at the details, and if we're sort of asking ourselves, okay, well, what do I think about that? How do I feel about that? How does this thing being described kind of fit in to the larger narrative? What is it doing? What kind of influence does it have over the characters or the plot? And then you can sort of arrive at your own conclusions and your own impression. Because every reader might have a slight, they're not always going to be totally different, but everybody can arrive at perhaps a slightly different dominant impression, or at least we're not all going to arrive at the exact same one. I might respond to a particular description a little bit differently than a peer or a friend, but we're probably going to be in the same general ballpark, or our response might be at least in part due to our differences in background or personality, but we're still going to be able to arrive or understand some kind of larger dominant impression about anything that's being described. Again, this could be a person, this could be a place, this could be an object, like something we can pick up and hold. There's really no limit to what can be described in a narrative. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit more about descriptive details, because this is a phrase that I'm often going to use. You might hear me say this, or you might see this as a comment on some of your writing. So let's just be clear what I mean. Anytime you are telling a story and describing things in your story, you need to include certain details, certain descriptive details, in order to deliver that dominant impression and to give the readers everything they need to be able to understand the narrative and to fully engage with it and enjoy it. So, for example, if you're describing a person, you might need to include some physical characteristics about that person. Those might be some important descriptive details to include. But different stories, different plots, different characters will emphasize different things. So some writers might decide that with a particular character, the physical traits are the most important things to describe and make clear to an audience. Other writers might decide, no, it's more important that you know things about this person's personality. You don't need to know exactly what they look like, but you need to know what foods they like. You need to know what kind of clothes they wear, or, their fashion sense. You need to know, other characteristics or other traits. They don't have to be physical. You might want to describe mental traits. You might want to describe likes and dislikes, but those are all descriptive details, and they can all tell us important things about characters, about the people that you are describing. So you have to decide, what details do I want to include? What details are important? What details are going to help my readers and draw them in? So also consider when you're describing a scene. So often with narratives, we can break the story down into a collection or sequence of scenes, individual moments in time and space when stuff is happening. Think about a movie or a TV show, or if you read comics, think of like an individual panel or a moment within the larger narrative. These are often times that we kind of feel like we're zooming in, to use a film term, but we're kind of zooming in on a particular moment, maybe a particular place, maybe a particular character. Maybe we're spending some time listening to characters talk. Right? We might hear a conversation between two characters. But this could very well be a developed scene, right? They're not just talking, they're talking somewhere. Maybe they're sitting, maybe they're standing, maybe they're driving in a car, right? Where are they? What's going on around them as they have their conversation? So when a writer is describing that conversation, they have to decide what they want to include. Are we going to get descriptive details about the car that the characters are riding in? Or is it more important to tell us what they are seeing as they drive down the road? Do we want more of a description of the scenery? Or do we really just want to focus on the characters and what they're thinking, what they're saying, maybe their facial expressions, their hand gestures? You can get a lot of mileage just out of describing those things. So there's no one right answer when it comes to, okay, what details do I want to describe? It really has to do with what the writer is trying to accomplish. What descriptive details are going to tell us what we need to know about the characters, or about the setting, or the plot, or the theme, or whatever. So again, description is really one of the many tools that you can use to strengthen your narrative. So you have to think about how you can best use the descriptive details to accomplish your goals. So a lot of times, yes, you're going to include physical details. You're also going to include details about your setting, the physical setting, like what are we looking at? What's the scenery? Where are we? But sometimes the details will include time. Are we moving forward, backwards? Is it the next day, right? Is it a week later? Those are also details. We're going to get details about characters, setting. We might learn things that happened before, things that might happen later, things that help us understand the plot sequence. But all of these details are part of the larger narrative that you are constructing. So oftentimes, once you kind of figure out what details you want to include in whatever description or scene you're writing, the next step for any writer will be to start organizing those descriptive details. How are we going to put them together? So again, very similar to what we talked about a couple of weeks ago with narrative, when we were talking about plot. And we said you can really think of plot as just the narrative events, the key, most important narrative events. So once a writer knows what those events are going to be, the next step is arranging them into a logical sequence, right? We need a narrative sequence. We need to know how the plot is going to unfold. How is it going to reveal itself to the readers or the watchers or the listeners? So, as we said, narrative sequence does not always have to be chronological. Sometimes we jump forward in time, sometimes we jump backwards with flashbacks, but the writer has to figure that out. It's the same with descriptive details. You have to figure out how you're going to organize them, how are you going to sequence them, how are they going to be arranged and presented to the readers. So you have a few options, as I mentioned in the overview. You can use what we call a spatial pattern. So this means you're arranging your descriptive details sort of based on how they actually appear in physical space. So think about this as like you're walking through a city, or you're walking through a building, or maybe you're driving down a highway in a car or a bus. You could just describe everything that you see. This would be a good exercise. You can just jot down everything that you're seeing, and you would probably instinctively arrange those details in a spatial pattern, because you're moving through space. You're moving through this, cityscape, or maybe you're walking through the woods. So everything that you're describing is sort of going to be arranged in a spatial pattern based on sort of where it's located in relation to you. So that's one way, particularly if you're trying to represent movement. If a character is moving, walking, driving, hiking, you might want to use a spatial pattern to describe what they're seeing, what they're experiencing, and how everything is arranged. But you could also use a chronological pattern if you're more focused on time. If your descriptive details have less to do with the mountains or the city or, the streets that you're walking through, and you're more interested in the passage of time. So, like, if you're narrating your first day at school, your first day at a new job, yeah, you might describe what things look like, but you might be more focused on chronology, time. What were you doing at 8 a.m.? What was happening at noon? What took place between noon and 4 p.m. So you might be arranging your details more like in a chronological fashion as you move through the day. But of course, you don't always have to go in order, like we've talked about. Maybe you want to jump ahead in time, maybe you want to go back in time, but if your emphasis is more on time and the passage of time, then you might use a chronological structure to arrange some of these details. And you can find other ways as well. Some writers use what we call sort of an emphatic pattern, which means they're kind of arranging the details based on emphasis. What are the most important details? They might get foregrounded or highlighted. They might come first or they might come last, depending on how the author wants to place emphasis, how the author wants to sort of point us to the most important details. And there's lots of ways to do that. So there's no one way to organize your descriptive details. You just have to figure out what's the best way for you, for what you're trying to accomplish in your narrative. Also, if we're just thinking about some of the like nuts and bolts of writing descriptions, I want to get into some of that now. And there's a few key words that you can use. We call these signal words, or in some cases they might be signal phrases, but they're just really good for orienting your readers. So if you use some of these words and phrases, particularly at the beginning of sentences, you're going to be able to better arrange those descriptive details, because you're going to kind of clue us in, clue your audience in to kind of how we're moving or what we're seeing. So again, these are words that kind of are important when it comes to like moving through space or moving through time. So just some examples. Words like first, next, then, and then I did this. Or words that are more about spatial relationships, like alongside, nearby, above, below, at, later. Or if we're going more by degree, best of all, worst of all, most important of all, right? These are the kinds of words and phrases that really help us build our descriptions, because they're giving really important information to the readers, right? Oh, this is above the other thing. This happened after the thing I was just talking about. This is the most important detail out of this entire list. These words and phrases help readers to understand that, so those are going to be important anytime you're putting together a good description. Another thing, I just want us to think a little bit more about nuts and bolts. Think about verbs and adjectives. These are types of speech that are really important when we're trying to write successful descriptions. So we know what verbs are, right? Verbs describe action. So obviously, if we are interested in providing, descriptive details about things that are happening, things that we are seeing, we need strong, vivid, active verbs. We need verbs that are interesting, but also verbs that are specific, if you know what I mean. Some verbs are pretty vague and general. Like when we see them, we obviously understand them, but they don't really tell us much. They just give us the most basic glimpse of the action being described. And they don't really tell us all that much about the action. Sometimes we want to replace weak verbs that are kind of general and vague with stronger verbs that are a lot more concrete and specific. So let me give you an example. And in the process of doing this, we can also sometimes get rid of kind of excess words. We can get rid of unnecessary words or phrases that aren't really doing very much, and we can replace them with individual verbs that are stronger and can do more work. So a very simple example here. I can tell you that I ran fast. Right? I can say I ran very fast to the store because it was an emergency. And that's fine. I mean, there's really nothing wrong with that sentence. It's not grammatically incorrect. It's pretty clear. It can work. But notice that I need a 2-word phrase to describe the action that's really the centerpiece of the sentence. I ran fast, right? Or a similar phrase, I walked slowly. Right? There's nothing wrong with those types of phrases, but they're a little bit clunky. And we can actually eliminate 2-word phrases like that just by substituting stronger verbs. See, with weak verbs like walked or ran, we often need an adverb. We need something to modify the verb to provide more information about the verb, because the verb by itself isn't doing very much. Walking is a great example. If I walked somewhere, I might need to kind of specify whether I was walking fast or walking slowly, because we can walk in a lot of different ways. So the verb walked is kind of weak, it's not wrong, but it's just not very powerful. It can't really do a lot by itself. So we need another word after it to modify it. We need the word slowly or fast or quickly or whatever, because the verb alone doesn't tell us very much. It's not very specific. So we can get rid of a sort of clunky verb phrase that consists of 2, maybe 3 words by using a stronger verb like sprinted. We know when we hear sprint that the person is going fast. So I don't have to include a word like fast to modify my weak verb. I'm telling you that I sprinted. You can't really sprint slowly. Right? So sprinting is a strong verb. It's more descriptive. It tells the reader more, and it does so in less space, with fewer words, without a full phrase. We just need that one word, and the reader knows, okay, you're moving fast. Same with walking. Instead of telling you I walked slowly to class yesterday, I could tell you that I shuffled to class. Now, shuffled, if you look it up, is a more descriptive verb. If you read the definition for it, it typically means that you're walking in such a way that your feet are barely getting picked up off the ground. So you're literally sort of dragging your feet. And it goes without saying that if you are shuffling, if you shuffled to class, then we know you are moving slowly. And if I tell my readers that I shuffled to class, that image that's going to be created for them as they see what I am describing, they're going to see a person shuffling along, not picking their feet up, maybe looking down at the ground, and they're going to know not only what the action is, they're going to know not only did I shuffle to class, they can read a little bit more into it as well, and they can make an educated guess that the character is probably feeling nervous or unhappy about going to class. Because if you're shuffling, that means that maybe you don't want to go to the place where you're going, right? But there's other ways to walk, right? I could saunter to class. That's another way to walk slowly. But if you look up the word saunter, that has a completely different meaning. If I'm sauntering, that means I'm probably confident, right? I'm walking slowly, but I'm feeling pretty good about myself. So if I saunter to class, that indicates that I'm feeling good, I'm feeling confident. But if I shuffle to class, that suggests that I'm nervous or I just don't want to go. Maybe I didn't study for the test. I'm not feeling as confident. So you see, the reason these verbs are good, they're not just strong and descriptive and specific. They also tell us a little bit about how the character is feeling. So you see, they're doing a lot more work than a weak verb like walked ever could. Because we don't know, okay, he walked, but so what? There's a lot of different ways to walk. If I tell you I sauntered, or if I tell you I shuffled, now you're able to gain more insight into how I, as the character, feel and what might be going on with me. So these are just little pro tips to make your descriptions better. And sometimes you will use adverbs. It's not wrong to use adverbs. Adverbs can modify verbs. They can also modify adjectives, and they can even modify other adverbs. And sometimes using adverbs can be good because they just provide a little bit more detail and a little bit more emphasis, a little bit more of an like an exclamation mark when you want one. So instead of just telling us that a character is sweating, you could tell us that a character is sweating profusely, right? By modifying the verb, by strengthening it a little bit more with an adverb, you're making more of an impact. You're making more of an impression. Now we know this person is either very nervous or they are very overheated because they're not just sweating, they're sweating profusely. If you're tapping your pen while you wait for the test to begin, you're not just tapping it, maybe you're tapping it impatiently. So now we know a little bit more about the character's state of mind, and we can imagine what that sounds like, right? The way I tap might be different if I'm relaxed versus if I'm nervous. If I'm impatient, I'm probably tapping at a more rapid rate. So not only does the reader know how the character feels now, but the reader can also imagine what it sounds like listening to the character tap their pen on their desk impatiently. So you want strong verbs. You want verbs that can actually do a lot of work. And then sometimes you want to use adverbs to modify verbs and other words just to strengthen the overall impression or description that you're creating. So we often talk about vivid. We want vivid language. If you look up the word vivid, it just means to produce strong feelings and clear images. And that's the name of the game with description. You want your readers to feel certain things, and you want them to see clear images, and also engage those other levels of imagery with hearing, smell, touch, or whatever else. Okay, so I have some more examples of those nuts and bolts in the week 4 overview. Let's move on to point of view, because this will take us back to what we were discussing a couple of weeks ago with narration. Just like any narrative will have a narrator who tells the story from a particular point of view. It might be third person, it might be first person. Also, descriptions usually have a point of view. They are usually narrated or delivered in a particular way. So we have to ask ourselves, who is making the description? Who is providing the description? Is it a first-person narrator who, again, might be talking about something direct, something that they saw, something that they felt, something that they, experienced firsthand? Or is it a third-person narrator, perhaps, providing an objective description about, things that are happening in the story? So there's different ways that we can think about the point of view from which a description is delivered. So you can even think about this kind of in terms of physical space as well. Like, think about it like you're hiking up a mountain, right? So your description, the way you're describing things will change based on what your physical location is on the mountain, like your sort of physical relationship with the mountain. Are you at the bottom of the mountain? Are you just starting out and you're looking up? That's a particular perspective or point of view. So if you're going to offer a description as you look up at the mountain, that's going to look a certain way, right? But meanwhile, if you're, say, midway up the mountain, you're around the halfway mark, now your perspective is very different. You can look down and see stuff. You can look up and see stuff. You might have a vista now. You can look out and see the surrounding countryside. But then once you get to the top of the mountain, you're going to have a totally different perspective. You're going to be able to see much further. You're going to see things from a greater distance, right? So things will look different up there. So in some cases, we can notice differences between the physical location of the person who is doing the describing, right? But then there's also your psychological relationship with the thing that you are describing. So this takes us back to a subjective description and the type of dominant impression that you want to deliver. So again, if you're a writer, what do you want your readers to feel about this pond that you are describing Is it a beautiful, tranquil pond that you want people to imagine swimming in and having fun, by the water? Or is it a creepy pond? Are you scared of the pond? Is there something about it that strikes you as disturbing? Is that how you want us to feel? So your own, the narrator's own relationship, psychological relationship with the thing being described can also be a big factor, right? Because it might affect how the readers feel. We might take on that same sort of psychological perspective. We might be afraid of the lake. We're happy about the mountain. If the narrator has a positive sort of psychological relationship with the mountain. So that's going to be important as well. And these will also drive individual choices that the writers will make. If you want to describe something as scary and foreboding, you're going to choose certain details that capture how it's scary, right? You're going to capture the way the water looks, or maybe there's like some, mud or sludge, or maybe it's really dark, or maybe there's just weird stuff that doesn't quite encourage us, right? But you're going to pick those kinds of details versus giving us a more positive impression. You're going to choose different kinds of details. The sun, the blue sky, the clear ocean, the bright white sand, whatever. So the details that you choose are largely based on what kind of psychological orientation you have towards the thing that's being described. All right, so think about those, and also let's go kind of come back to word choice a little bit, because again, sometimes descriptions are really just a matter of choosing good individual words. So we talked about this in terms of verbs and adverbs, but also think about the connotations and the denotations of individual words that you might use. So if you look these words up, you'll see that the denotation of a word simply means sort of like the dictionary definition, what the word actually means. But then we have connotations. Connotations are the associations that we have with a particular word, the way a word makes us feel, the type of feeling that might be evoked, or an emotion, or just a sort of way of thinking that might be brought to mind by a particular word. So, a common sort of example of this would be, think about how different of an impression you might have of somebody if they're described as sassy versus being described as bossy, right? Those are words with pretty similar denotations, but they have very different connotations. Often sassy will have positive connotations. We sort of like that word. It's often used to describe like little old ladies or cute little kids. So we often think positively about that word. Versus bossy, which has often negative connotations. We don't like the way that word makes us feel. We might have a more negative impression of a character being described that way. You could think of this also with words like slim versus skinny, or slim versus scrawny, smell versus odor, right? These are words with very similar dictionary definitions, but they have different connotations. They make us feel different ways. We like scent. We might not have as many positive connotations for odor, right? They have similar definitions, similar denotations, but we have different associations with those words. We feel different ways with those words. So connotations matter. When you're choosing a particular word, especially if you're describing a person or describing an object, you want to think about what connotations a particular word is going to bring. And sometimes you'll pick a word specifically because you want a positive connotation, or maybe you want a negative connotation, so you pick a word that you know has that. So that's another level to consider with word choice. And I've already mentioned imagery, so the last thing we can get into for today is figurative language. So this is a very important tool when providing descriptions. Figurative language simply means language that leaves the realm of the literal. We are leaving everyday reality. So if I make a literal statement, that means I am grounded in material, objective reality. And I am talking about something that I can prove is literally true. So these are usually things that we can touch, see, verify. We are in reality. But if I am speaking figuratively, that means that my statements don't necessarily need to be factual. They don't need to be literally true. Because instead of trying to capture objective reality the way I would with a literal statement, instead, if I'm speaking figuratively, I'm trying to make a larger point. I'm trying to make a connection. I'm trying to make a comparison. I'm trying to convey an idea that goes a little bit beyond this desk that I'm sitting at, this empty water bottle that's next to me, this pen that I'm holding. I'm going beyond these aspects of everyday reality, and I'm trying to capture something bigger. Something a little bit more significant, perhaps, in the grand scheme of things. So if I'm speaking figuratively, I have different goals, and I'm often going to be using some different types of language. So you guys already know some popular types of figurative language because this stuff gets taught in middle school and certainly in high school. But it never hurts to review the basic definitions and to just make sure that we are comfortable with these terms and concepts, starting with metaphors, perhaps the most common and popular type of figurative language. So a metaphor is simply a comparison between two unlike things. That's all it is. People often get intimidated by metaphors because we're led to believe that metaphors are really complicated when in reality they're not. I mean, they can be, like anything, they can be complicated, but the basic idea is not that complex. We're simply taking two things that are not literally the same. Right? We are leaving the world of literal, factual reality, but we're making a larger point. And we're saying that two things are alike, even though they're not, but we're saying that they are in order to make a larger statement or to express a larger idea. So just to give you a really simple example, if I say to a friend about a mutual friend, she's drowning in a sea of grief. This is kind of an overwrought metaphor, but it is an example of what the type of speech is. So I'm making a comparison here, even though it might not immediately be clear that that's what I'm doing. If I'm saying that my friend is drowning in a sea of grief, you can tell that's not a literal statement, okay? She is not literally drowning in a body of water, okay? Instead, I'm simply comparing the act of drowning to the intense grief that she is literally feeling after the death of a loved one, okay? So I'm making a comparison. I'm saying feeling a lot of grief is the same or similar to drowning in the ocean. That's not literally true. Feeling grief is not literally the same as drowning. We can all see the many differences between the two things. But I'm making the point that she feels like she's drowning. It's not a literal statement, it's a figurative statement. She's so overcome by grief, she feels like she can't breathe. She feels like she's suffocating. She feels like she, can't keep her head above water. So I'm using a metaphor to describe the way my friend feels. I'm not making a literal statement about her drowning. I'm describing how she feels. That's what a metaphor can often allow me to do. Of course, I could also just say, she's really sad, but that's boring. That's not very specific. That's not very detailed, and that's not very descriptive. So I can use a metaphor to better capture the way that she's feeling. Another kind of famous metaphor, they claim Shakespeare said it. I don't know if he really did, but he said, all the world is a stage and all people merely players. I'm paraphrasing. That's a metaphor, right? The world is not literally a stage where plays take place. That's not literally true. And all of us people, we are not actors. We are not literally actors who make a living performing in plays. Those are not true factual statements. But we see the larger point that the metaphor is trying to make, right? We often imagine the world, our lives, as narratives, and we often think of ourselves and the people that we know as characters in the narratives. So he's talking specifically about plays, but this can really apply to any narrative. So it's a metaphor comparing everyday life with narratives. We know they're not the exact same, but the point is we feel like they're the same. We feel like our life is a movie or a play or any other narrative unfolding on the page or up on stage or maybe on a screen. So figurative language is just another way to express yourself, but it's kind of a more interesting way. It's often a more descriptive way. And it often gives you a chance to kind of take your reader on a little bit of a journey to leave the bounds of everyday reality, if even just for a moment. So that's what a metaphor is. A simile is very similar. It's doing the same thing. It's also a comparison between two unlike things. But it's just a difference with words. With a simile, you're normally going to see the words like or as. So I move fast like a cheetah. That's a very silly simile. I'm once again comparing two unlike things. I'm comparing myself to a cheetah, and I'm claiming that I am as fast as a cheetah. But even if I was a very fast person, which I'm not, that would still not be a literal statement because no human is as fast as a cheetah. But by saying that, by using a simile like that, I'm making it clear that the person I'm describing is fast, right? Not literally as fast as a cheetah, but fast, right? So I'm accomplishing the same thing by providing a comparison between two things that aren't really alike, but they might seem alike. And by comparing them, I can deliver a larger impression or, just an idea that I want my reader to understand. So again, a metaphor usually won't have the words like or as. It's just saying one thing is the other thing. Whereas a simile is saying one thing is like another thing. So you can use them pretty interchangeably. They're very similar. They're doing similar work. But a simile just kind of qualifies it a little bit. It's not saying that they're the same. They're just similar, right? It's like it. It's similar to it. It's close. But again, we're making larger statements or we're delivering information in a slightly more fun, imaginative way. So some other popular types of figurative language would include personification. That means you are assigning non-human traits. You're assigning human traits to non-human things. So you're assigning human characteristics to animals or nature or inanimate objects, right? That's personification. And we do that a lot. If you say the sea was angry or your dog was mad at you, right? You're investing human qualities to non-human things. And that's often done for effect. That's often done, again, to describe what it feels like. A dog, I guess, can be mad, but they're not mad like humans are mad. But you might feel like your dog is mad. The ocean can't actually be angry, but if it's really rough out there and the waves are big, it might feel like the ocean is angry. So again, you're not capturing objective reality per se, but you're capturing feelings. You're capturing what things seem like, and that can be a way to get inside a character's head and better understand what's going on. Also, hyperbole, that's an intentional exaggeration done for emphasis. So I've told you to clean up your room 100 times. That's probably not a literally true statement, but it captures how your mom feels when they've told you multiple times to clean your room and you still haven't done it. And then finally, sometimes we'll see allusions. Allusions with an A. Not an illusion like something that's not real, but rather an illusion with an A, which means references to things, people, or events that exist outside the text. So these are references to people or things that don't necessarily take place within the text, but readers still know what they are. So if your narrator mentions that a character has an Achilles heel, that's actually an allusion to the character Achilles from ancient Greek myth. And Achilles is probably not a character in this particular narrative that we're reading, but this reference to the character is pretty familiar to us because Achilles was only vulnerable in the back of his heel, so we know what that term means. It's just a weakness or a sort of vulnerable spot for any person. So that's an allusion to a character that's not in the text, but we know what it means, right? Or if you compare somebody who's lying to Pinocchio, or if you compare a beautiful setting to the Garden of Eden, those are places and people that aren't actually in the narrative. They're not, characters, they're not settings in the narrative. They exist outside the narrative, but because most readers are familiar with them, again, you can use them to help you describe things, compare things, and deliver larger meaning. Okay, so that's enough for this week. We're going to work on some description throughout the week, and I have a couple of different things for you guys to do in this week's discussion post. So the first thing is pretty straightforward. Just respond to the 2 reading assignments that I've given you for week 4. They're brief, okay? This is a pretty light week as far as reading goes. You have 2 pieces, but they're both very short. So one is by Robert Bly. It's called Sitting on Some Rocks in Shaw Cove, California. It's about a page and a half, but it's really just nothing but an extended, weird description. So spend some time with that. And the other piece is called What is a Burrito? A Primer by Jonathan Gold. He's a food critic. Another very short piece. It originally appeared as an article in a newspaper or a magazine, I believe. And it's not much of a narrative, but Gold is going around to different places trying different burritos, and he's describing all of these different kinds of regional types of burritos. So great adjectives, great verbs in both of these pieces, lots of good descriptive details to look at. So once you've responded to those, the second part of the discussion post might be a little bit more fun. I want us to play charades. Okay, so if you guys have ever done charades, you know that nowadays the game is typically acted out. So you're trying to get your teammate to guess whatever you are, and normally you're doing that by sort of acting or, using physical gestures. That's a more modern way of playing charades. The old way that I want us to go back to was by writing descriptions. So like 100, 200 years ago, charades were really done more on paper. So somebody would write out a detailed description of a person or a place or a thing, and then the readers would have to read that description and figure out what was being described. Based on the details, based on everything that they saw, they would have to try to put it together. So let's do that and follow the instructions that I've provided in the discussion post prompt. And we'll see if we can guess the things being described by our classmates. Try to make yours kind of hard to guess, but don't make it impossible. Okay? So don't describe things that your classmates would never know, like your grandma, who none of them have ever met, or some place that you've been, but you have no reason to believe that anybody else in the class has ever been there. So it's good to maybe choose like celebrities or popular job occupations or famous places that a lot of people have been. Try to pick stuff that's doable, but don't make it too easy. Make it a challenge. Okay. So if you have any questions, let me know. And otherwise, I'll see you next week as we get started on Essay 1.